Today's daf we're going to be learning is Shevuot Daf Memvav. We're going to get started from the second line of our daf. We have Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba. Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba. Shalchu lemi be'Rav l'Shmuel. Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba says that they sent a message from the Beit Midrash of Rav to Shmuel. This usually happened after Rav died, and the students needed someone to ask their questions to. They would go ask their questions of Shmuel. Yilamdenu Rabbeinu, please teach us, Rabbi. Uman omer. Following case, a craftsperson says, "Shnaim katzatz tali, v'hala omer lo katzatz shelacha ela echad." And the buyer says, that we'll call him later the balabayit, okay? The person who goes to this craftsperson says, "Listen, I only promised you I was going to pay you one, not two." Minishba, who takes the oath? So again, if we go by the socher, the buyer, right? So the worker, then it should be the uman, the craftsperson. Amar lahem bezo yishava balabayit v'yafsid uman. Says this is an exception to the rule. This is not like the case in our Mishnah. Again, we talked about these two cases at the end of yesterday's daf. This is not like the case in the Mishnah where it's a debate. Did the person get paid? Did they not get paid? The debate here is, what was the price that they agreed upon? Everybody agrees there was a job and there was a price and there's someone to be paid. The debate is what? How much? So that the Rav Shmuel said to them, in this case, it's the balabayit who takes the oath that it was less money, and the uman loses, the craftsperson loses, and you only pay whatever the minimum amount is. Kind of like a motzi mechaver alav haraya, or like a nishba ve'eno mishalem, right? Takes the oath and doesn't pay. Tzitza, but now what's the reason? Because tzitza v'dai mitkar dekirei inshe. Now, if we talked about with the amount of the salary, when we talked about in the Mishnah about did the salary get paid or not, there we have an assumption that the employer might not forget, they might forget who paid, who got paid, who did it. But here we assume for sure when you go to a store to buy something from a craftsperson, for sure you remember the price you were told. Okay, that's an assumption we make. Very interesting assumption, right? Could be right, could be wrong. Although you could imagine if people are tight with their money, they're going to be very careful about knowing that. Again, one could say also careful about paying their employees. So anyway, we're going to talk later also about this distinction between the cases. So now the Gemara says, Ini, is this really true that Shmuel said this? V'hatani Rabba bar Shmuel brought a following braita. Katzatz, hamotzim echaveru alav haraya. If you made an agreement of how much money, and there's a debate about how much money was agreed upon, hamotzim echaveru alav haraya. If you want to get the money to be paid, right? You want to get paid more money, the burden of proof is on the uman. Ve'ilo mai teraya. However, right, if you don't bring a proof, paka, then everything kind of stays as is. Now, amai, yishava balabayit v'yafsid uman. So now they say, why? In this case, it shouldn't be just the assumption here is the status quo is unless you prove as the craftsperson, you basically, right, if you can't prove it, then what did we say before? Well, if you can't prove it, the balabayit takes the oath, right? Here it sounds like the balabayit just wins out without anything, right? The balabayit will just pay less money. But amai, yishava balabayit, doesn't the balabayit have to take an oath? V'yafsiduman. So Rav Nachman, let's study in Katani. Rav Nachman says they're each talking about different scenarios. Oh, mivi raya v'yitol. Either, right, if you can bring a proof, then you can get the full price. Oh, yishava balabayit v'yafsiduman. Or the balabayit will take the oath, and the craftsman will, in other words, it sounds like in the event that there is no proof, then we allow the oath to go to the balabayit. So what if the balabayit won't take the oath? And it sounds like actually the person gets paid the full amount. Okay, the umam will get paid the full amount that they claim if the balabayit is unwilling to take the oath. Now we start with another braita though, a meitive. This is going to raise a difficulty on what we established until now. Hanoten talito leuman. If you give your talit to an uman, okay, to fix whatever it might be, uman omer katzatz telishtayim. Hala omer lo katzatz dilacha el echad. And again, we have the owner of the talit and the craftsperson, right? Maybe the tailor. They're having an argument. Was it two or was it one? Kolzman shetalit biyad uman, balabayit lavi raya. If the talit is still in the hands of the uman, And the Baal Bayit has to prove what the price was. Otherwise, the Baal Bayit has to pay the full price, meaning the Uman has the upper hand at that point. Nitanalo, as soon as he gives it to him, well, bismano nishba v'notel. If it's still within the time that the person has to pay. Now, there's something called, right, don't delay your payments. So if it's a day worker, you have to pay them by night, by the end of the night. If it's a night worker, you have to pay them by the end of the next day. But if it's an uman, a craftsperson, they actually have to be paid on the day of. So if it's the daytime, you have till the end of that day, till sunset. If they brought it back to you at night, then you have till the end of that night. So if it's within that time frame, and this is the key line, what do you see here? Something we haven't seen yet, which is the uman can take the oath and get the full price back. Now, this seems to go against what we saw before, because before we said if they're having an issue with the price difference, we don't do one of these, the socher gets to take the oath. No, and if there's going to be an oath, it's going to be on the balabayit. So this is going to be the contradiction. Once the time is passed and you've already given it back and the time has passed for when they should have paid you, then it's up to the uman to basically prove how much, right, that it was the higher price. Anyway, the important part for us, our purposes, bismano mia nishba v'notel amai yishaba balabayit v'yafsid uman. Right? Why, if it's still within the time frame, should the uman, right, the nishba v'notel, it shouldn't be that. It should be yishaba balabayit. Balabayit should take the oath, not the worker, not the craftsperson. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. So how do we resolve this contradiction? Very simply, we're going to say that Shmuel and Rabbi bar Shmuel's Braita represent one position, where it's going to be the rabbi's position. And this Braita is going to be Hamani, who is according to Rabbi Yehuda. It's Rabbi Yehuda's position, Damal. As long as the Shvuah, as long as there's an oath. Now, remember, Rabbi Yehuda's position in the Mishnah, remember, it's all about Moda b'mikta. If it's Moda b'mikta, and there's a Doraita halacha of a Shvuah, which is in a Moda b'mikta, the person admits part of the claim, which is this case, because they debate about whether it's one or two, but they at least agree that the guy owes one. Now, if the Shvuah is notei tzah balabayit, if the balabayit is supposed to take the oath, if there's a worker there, the worker always has the rights. We move the Shvuah over from the employer to the employee. So now they want to know, hey, Rabbi Yehuda, where do we have this opinion of Rabbi Yehuda? Where is it clear that Rabbi Yehuda will say this also in the case of a disagreement about how much money and not just have you gotten paid or not, have you not gotten paid? So which Rabbi Yehuda is this? Rabbi Yehuda Dimatnitin. If it's Rabbi Yehuda of the Mishnah, Achmure Kamachmir. Can't be Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, because Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah is stringent. How do we know that? Ditnan, what does it say in the Mishnah? Rabbi Yehuda Omer Aj Tesha Miktzat Hoda'ah. Remember, the Mishnah said the Sachir, the worker, gets to always take the oath. And Rabbi Yehuda said, not exactly, only if it's a Moda b'miktzat. So if that's the case, then Rabbi Yehuda, who's being more stringent in the Mishnah, if the rabbis who in the Mishnah said, sure, there's a disagreement about whether the person got paid, so the worker gets to just take the oath. And Rabbi Yehuda says, only if it's Moda b'miktzat. Well, if in the case of katzatz, Rabbi Yehuda thinks that also you get to take an oath, then obviously we're going to assume the rabbis are more lenient in that case and also say that they can take the oath. Now, we just said the rabbis say they don't take the oath. So now it's confusing, because it can't really be clear from our Mishnah that if the tone in the Mishnah is the rabbis are more lenient, then if they disagree about this case, about the case in the Mishnah, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to disagree about, and then we don't know what Rabbi Yehuda is going to say from the Mishnah. It's not clear what he would say in the case. If the rabbis would say there's no oath there, maybe Rabbi Yehuda will say there's no oath there at all, even in a Moda b'miktzat. Okay, because we just saw the rabbis say, again, not that there's no oath, I should be more clear. The rabbis about this case say the worker doesn't take the oath, the socher doesn't take the oath. So if the rabbis say the socher doesn't take the oath, we can assume Rabbi Yehuda thinks the socher doesn't take the oath at all. And therefore, you can't assume from our Mishnah, because again, the direction of the Mishnah is the rabbis are more lenient. So if the rabbis are going to be stringent here, Rabbi Yehuda will be even more stringent and not even allow it. So you can't assume from our Mishnah even though that is the position of Rabbi Yehuda, you can't assume that Rabbi Yehuda will say the same thing about katsatz. When the rabbis are stringent, you can assume he might be more stringent or just as stringent. So can't work. Let's try Rabbi Yehuda de Braita. Ella Rabbi Yehuda de Braita must be from this Braita, though we could tell that in fact Rabbi Yehuda would agree in our Mishnah and would say the same thing, but we wouldn't know it from our Mishnah, but we would know it from this Braita because this Braita says explicitly Rabbi Yehuda's opinion about this case. Ditanya, as it says in a Braita, Sachir Chosman Shelo Avar Alav Zmano Harei Ze Nishbav Notel. Okay, as long as the time hasn't come, the socher gets to take the oath and get the money back, right? Get their money. This is about if they got paid or not paid. V'im lav eno nishbav notel. And if not, if it's past the time that the person should have gotten paid, we can assume the person was paid and the person takes the oath, right? Can't take an oath anymore. Okay, they can't take an oath to get paid. V'amar Rabbi Yehuda, ematai. Rabbi Yehuda says, what do you mean? It's not just any case they can always take the oath in the first case. Bizman she'amar lo ten lischavi 50 dinar sheyesh li biyadcha, v'hu omer itkabalti mehem dinar zahav. And that's the case we saw before. The person says you owe me 50, and the employer says I only owe you 25. Right, 1 gold dinar is 25 dinarim of kesef of silver. Osha amar lo. Notice this is our case. Shtaim katzatzta. We agreed on 2. V'hala omer lo katzatzta l'chayil echad, and the buyer says I only promised you 2. I only promised you 1. Okay, same thing. Aval. Okay, but what does Rabbi Yehuda say? Only moda b'miktzat does this work, but it works in both cases. And that's what we were looking for. But if the person says, I never hired you, or I hired you, but I already paid you, then the burden of proof becomes on the buyer. Okay, because according, or the worker, not the buyer. They have to prove it because that's not moda b'miktzat, and that's Rabbi Yehuda's position. But now we have a basic problem because something doesn't jive here. In our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda is lenient and the rabbis are strict. But Rabbi Yehuda stays consistent and the rabbis move from lenient to strict because in the katzatz case, they don't allow the worker to take an oath at all. Right? Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says the worker can't take an oath if they don't agree about anything, but if there's moda b'miktzat and the employer agrees about half the claim, then in both cases, you can do it, whether it's an issue of how much or whether it's an issue of did the person get paid at all. So now comes Matkefla Rav Shisha B'rei Rav Idi. He comes with an attack and he says something doesn't work here. Ela katzatz Rabbi Yehuda v'lo Rabbanan. Wait, if you're going to say katzatz, this braita that we had about that the worker can take the oath in a katzatz case about the disagreement about this is Rabbi Yehuda, not the rabbis. Hashecha demachmir Rabbi Yehuda mikile Rabbanan. Right in our Mishnah, where Rabbi Yehuda is strict, the rabbis are lenient. Hecha demecha Rabbi Yehuda machmir Rabbanan, where Rabbi Yehuda is lenient, the rabbis are strict. That doesn't make any sense. Okay, so comes the Gemara as a retort back to Rav Shisha. Elamai, Rabbanan. So you want to say, okay, well then this case of katzatz where they allow the worker to take an oath, when there's moda b'miktzat, let's assume that's the rabbis. And Rabbi Yehuda is the one who's strict and says no, the other source we saw, which says the worker can't take the oath in a katzatz case. But then, Elahadatani Rabba Bashmuel, katzatz, motzim chaver alav haraya, mani lo Rabbi Yehuda v'lo Rabbanan. But then we're going to have a problem because if you say, right, the assumption is, I should say it differently. If we say the Braita is the rabbis, okay, which said that basically you could take the oath because they hold the more lenient position. And then we'll assume, right, Rabbi Yehuda, we already know what Rabbi Yehuda holds. We already know that Rabbi Yehuda holds you could take an oath in that case. So if you're going to say that opinion is the rabbis, and the rabbis at least are in sync with Rabbi Yehuda in that way, okay, that's really, I should correct myself. It's that the rabbis agree with Rabbi Yehuda there, and that Braita matches the rabbis, and that at least the rabbis aren't more lenient, but they're at least the same, right? Because how could the rabbis be stricter? But then you have a problem because the Braita, Rabba Bar Shmuel, that says katzatz motzim chaver alav haraya, and basically the worker can't take an oath at all. The burden of proof is on the worker. Mani lo Rabbi Yehuda v'lo Rabbanan. Well, that doesn't match Rabbi Yehuda's position. It doesn't match the rabbi's position because nobody thinks that that's the case. Everybody thinks the worker could take the oath, right? Yehuda can say moda b'miktzat, and maybe the rabbis say even if you disagree entirely, maybe the rabbis are more lenient there also. But either which way, it doesn't make sense. So Ella, right, and that source can't fit with either opinion, and that's not good. So Ella Amar Rava Bahakami Palge. This is the root of the machlok. Rabbi Yehuda Saval, but now we're going to understand, in other words, again, we're left with this strange situation where Rabbi Yehuda is strict in one case and lenient in the other. But now we're going to understand why that is, and we're going to understand why the rabbis are lenient in one and strict in the other. Rabbi Yehuda actually is consistent with his position. It's the rabbis who change, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda, relative to the rabbis, is either lenient or strict. So Rabbi Yehuda is very consistent because Rabbi Yehuda says, as we explained before, and the truth is we explained all this before, but now we're putting it all in context and seeing the whole picture, and that will end this section. Rabbi Yehuda savar b'deoraita avdule rabbanan takanta l'sachir. When there's a deoraita shvuah, a deoraita oath, meaning a shvuah moda b'miktzat, because remember, Rabbi Yehuda is consistent in his position. Only in a moda b'miktzat does the worker get to take the oath. But why the worker? Usually moda b'miktzat, the person who wants to keep the money, keep the status quo, keep the money in their hands, gets to take the oath. But in this case, the rabbis made a takana for a sachir. That was what we learned in the Mishnah. The rabbi said, when there's a Torah oath, we're going to just move that oath from the employer to the employee. Ubedurabanan have takanta, v'takanta l'takanta lo avdina. But when it comes to a rabbinic oath, when there's no moda b'miktzat, that's Rabbi Yehuda's whole thing, and no moda b'miktzat, the worker doesn't take the oath. Why not? Because when there's no moda b'miktzat, and we have this disagreement, well, the rabbis instituted a shvuah so that, we try to figure out who's telling the truth. But that's just a rabbinic ordinance. And once there's a rabbinic ordinance, well, takanta l'takanta lo avdina, we don't do a takana na takana. Remember, the first takana we discussed was that the worker gets to take the oath instead of the employer. But we're not going to do that on a place where there was already a takana of a d'Rabbanan oath. And therefore, the d'Rabbanan oath goes right straight to the employer. Okay, so he could just keep the money in his hands. Now let's explain the rabbi's position. Rabbanan savre, but Rabbanan nami avdina takanta l'sachir. In a rabbinic situation, rabbinic oath, he has no problem that we can just make another takana. That doesn't bother him. He says, okay, sachir, we always switch it to the worker when there's a rabbinic oath. So, right, rabbinic oath, Torah oath, it doesn't matter. So whether it's moda b'miktzat, whether it's not moda b'miktzat, the worker gets the oath. However, why did we make that takana? Because we assume that the employer might not remember who they paid and who they didn't pay. However, katzitza mid kardakir, we already saw this. When it comes to what price you're going to pay for someone to do work for you, you remember that. Nobody forgets that. And therefore, there's no reason for the takana at all in that case. So it's a per case issue. Okay, it depends on the situation and whether or not we think the person has could be making a mistake, and therefore we move the oath to the other side. If we think they're not making a mistake, then we let them take the oath. Okay. That was all the first section of our Gemara, which I'll review right now. We won't review at the end of the daf, which is basically these two approaches and the different sources that seem to say, in the case of katzatz, where the disagreement is not about whether or not the person got paid, but the disagreement is about how much, do we take an oath or not? We saw that Rabbi Yehuda is consistent with his position. If it's moda b'miktzat, yes, because we're going to move that shvuah Torah over to the socher, but not if this not moda b'miktzat, right? There's no admission at all, then no. And on the flip side, we have the rabbis who basically say that if we're worried that the employer's lying or might lie and not even mean to lie, but might be confused about things, then we move the oath to the other side. When there's no need for that, we don't. That's why the rabbis are lenient in one case and stricter in the katzatz case. Nigza. Now we're back to the Mishnah, the cases in the Mishnah that we saw. Nigza, if you're stolen from. So somebody took something from your house, and now you can take an oath about it to get it back. So ketzad, what did it say? So somebody comes and testifies that this guy came into the house in order to take collateral. So now you can take an oath and say, hey, this is what they took. Maybe they didn't take anything, right? It says they came to take something. And in fact, why would we think maybe they didn't take anything? Because Milo Amar Rav Nachman, didn't Rav Nachman say, a guy who has an axe in his hand, I'll go chop down someone's tree. Right, he stands there threatening with an axe. And later you go and see that the tree was cut down. We don't assume he cut down the tree because Who knows who cut down the tree? Just because people threaten, there's a lot of bullies out there that try to threaten and say, I'm going to do this. They don't necessarily act upon it. So we can't assume it was them. Alma, avid inish degazim below avid. We assume people exaggerate and they don't necessarily follow up on their threats. Hachanami degazim below avid. And how many times have you made false threats, especially to your children? Okay, so hachanami, or maybe your parents made false threats to you. So hachanami digazim below avid. Here also, we can assume the person maybe said, I'm coming to take collateral. It doesn't mean they're going to. Okay, so they change the Mishnah and they say, Ema umishkano. The case is, the person came to your house and actually took a collateral. Okay, so if they actually took, v'lechsema mishkano, so why don't we just see what they took? And then why do we need anyone to take oaths? What's the disagreement about? You came into my house to take collateral and you walk out with something under your clothing. And I say, hey, so people see you with carrying something underneath, but they can't see what it is. So I'm allowed to take the oath because it's clear you stole. That makes a lot of sense. I'm allowed to take an oath about what it is that you stole. I'm a Rav Yehuda. Now we're going to get off on a tangent about something else where you can hide something under your clothes, but not having to do with this case. Rav Yehuda says, if they see somebody go into my house, take an object under their clothes and walk out with it. And later they claim that they bought it from me. Okay? That person is not believed. Rashi even adds, even with an oath. They could take an oath, we don't believe them. Now, why not? Because they're hiding something under, and it seems weird, right? They're obviously hiding something. They don't want to tell me, right? Something must be up here. They must be stealing it. But now, even though the Gemara says, Eino Ne'eman, Rabbi Yehuda said, but now we're going to have all sorts of limitations here and say, well, you'll be believed in this case, and you'll be believed in this case, and you'll be believed in that case, and that case. So let's see. If I don't sell things in my house generally, then that's when we're talking about you're not going to be believed. But if I sell things in my house often, then you're believed to say you came into my house and bought something, even though it's under your garment. Now let's go back to that track where you're not believed because I don't generally sell things. If I claim you stole something that most people don't usually put under their jacket, right? They usually hold it out in the open because people aren't embarrassed to walk around with it. Okay, so if it's something that normally you don't hide and then you hide it underneath, we're not going to trust you. However, like let's say you come to my house and you buy underwear. Okay, you don't want to walk around carry the underwear in your hands, so you put it under your jacket. Okay, so if it's something like that, then we don't suspect you that you're hiding something. We suspect you because, right, we assume that you're hiding it because you don't want to walk around carrying it out in the open. Well, if you don't generally hide things, we also still do. Okay, so assuming it's not, right, even if it's not something that you generally hide. So it's something most people carry out in the open. However, this is only if you're a person who's not a private person and you're happy to carry your bags out and let everybody see what it is you're carrying. But let's say I bought some jugs in your house and I don't want everyone to see the jugs I bought, so I hide them under my jacket. So that's a different story. If I'm a person who likes to keep private, I don't want everybody seeing what I purchased, then it makes sense. Again, as soon as we can make sense out of it, I know I switched the people, but you were in my house hiding something. If you're embarrassed to carry those things around, you like to just be private about things and you're holding them underneath them, we don't suspect you of lying. We believe you that you bought it from me. Even if I don't normally sell things in my house, right? We're now with the even this, even that, we're still going to believe you. And by the way, this is only if you're not going to be believed if I claim you just borrowed it and you claim that you bought it. Why? But if I claim you stole it from me, then you're totally believed. And we don't believe me at all. Why? We don't allow someone to just come and claim that somebody stole from them without any sort of witnesses. So if I just claim you stole, then we assume I'm lying. Okay, and therefore you're believed. Okay, you have to take an oath anyway, to like a rabbinic oath to say this is really mine, but you're believed. We're going to have more of this. This is only if there are things that generally people borrow or rent. And then again, you're not believed. But if it's something that people generally don't rent or borrow, then you can't claim you borrowed it, right? In other words, then ne'eman. Then I am not believed anymore because the assumption is I sold it to you. If it's not meant to be rented or borrowed, then you're believed again because why else would you have it? Okay, if I claim you just borrowed it, but it's not something that people generally borrow, then it's also you're gonna, you as the person who walked out with this item actually will be believed in that case. How do we know this? Here you have what we said in the beginning, the beginning of that previous sentence. If they generally are rented, then you're not believed to say you purchased it. However, if they are, then you would be believed. Ki hada Rava, here's a case. Rava, apigzuza de sarbala v'safra da agadata, he took a pair of scissors that were used for like a tailor, seamstress kind of thing, and safra da agadata, agadic books, miyatme, from orphans. And somebody claimed, I loaned it to your father. Your father didn't return them, and now he died, and there's no one to prove it, but they're mine. Well, b'dvarim asuyim last year, because the scissors and the books were things that generally people lent out. Therefore, Rava said the person who claimed they were theirs and they lent it to the kid's father, they get to take it back. Okay. Now, that was an aside because that was all about a different ramification of hidden things. And this was in a debate between you and me about whether you actually borrowed it from me or whether you bought it from me. I'm a Rav. Afilu shomer nishba. Now we're back to the original halacha about if you have if the person says you walked into my house, you took a collateral, and and then I can take an oath and say, right, that's mine. Okay, you stole it. So Rava says, afilu shomer nishbat. Even if it's not me, but it's the person watching my house, they can also take the oath saying that it's mine. Afilu ishto shel shomer nishbat. Even his wife, we assume that she also takes care of the house. But by Rav Papa, he says, what about schiro lekitomai? What if it's a worker, like a day worker in the house, or a person who works in the fields, he gathers the crops, that's the lekito. Are they believed? Because do they pay attention to who comes in and who comes out? Like, it's not really their job. The watchman of the house or the watchwoman, they're checking. But the renter, not so much. So my teku, we don't know the answer. Now, until now we said, I can claim you stole something and I can claim this is what you stole and give me the money. What if I claim it was an expensive silver goblet, right? To what extent can I claim, I could make up anything. Chazina inish de amitu. We check if I'm a trustworthy person. Inish de mehemanhu de ina sheikabe. Am I someone, for example, who people leave stuff to watch and I watch over people's expensive items? Well, if that's the case, then I'm trusted. And then mishtabev shaka. Then I can take an oath about anything and get it back. Be low, and if not, then not. Nechbal ketzad. Next case in the Mishnah, I walk into your house and I come out injured. We can blame you, right? I can take an oath and say you injured me. Well, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel lo shanu ela. This is only true if b'makom sheyachol lechabel ba'atzmo. But makom she'eno yachol lechabel ba'atzmo notel shelo b'shvuah. Yehuda says something very interesting in the name of Shmuel. That the need for me to take an oath is only if I could have done it myself. But if I couldn't have done it myself, then I can even get it without an oath because it's obvious you did it. And we're going to have a little question. Why is it so obvious? Well, I could have gotten an injury on the wall. I could have rubbed up against the wall. I could have slipped on the floor. I could have fallen down the steps, right? All sorts of injuries could have happened. It's not necessarily that you did it to me. Well, Tani Rabbi Chia sha'altalo mishicha begabo ubena tzilei yadav. Rabbi Chia brought a bright that says, now we're talking about, I walked into your house and I come out with a bite on my back or on the back of the top part of my arms where I couldn't have bitten myself, and therefore it must be you did it. To which they asked the obvious question, Dilma achera, but maybe someone else did it in the house. How do we know it was you? Deleka achera. Obviously, we're talking about a case. There was nobody else in the house. And then I'd be able to, right? In that case, I'd be able to get even without a note. But if it was possible I did it to myself, then I would have to take the oath. Shekenegdo chashud afilu shvuat, right? If you're suspect, you're supposed to take the oath, but you're a person who is suspect that you take false oaths. Like, for example, a Shevuot Shav, right? Even a false oath. What's a Shevuot Shav? It's like a nothing thing. You say, I swear that I saw a pink elephant, which you didn't. So it's like a silly Shevuot, okay? But it's not a true one. So Maya Filu Shevuot Shav. Why did it say even Shevuot Shav? Well, lo mebaya kamar. What it is a lo mebaya structure, which means you don't need to say this, right? Even more than that. Lo mebaya hanafti ilu kfirat mamon. Obviously, we don't need to say if you deny, right? You lied about a monetary thing, which you made money off of a deal and lied falsely for it. Then obviously you're not going to be able to take an oath. Even if it's just being dishonest about nothing, having no ramifications for you, then you're still not believed. So what about a Shevuot Bitoy? I said I'm going to do something and I didn't do it. Maybe also, why didn't it say that? Because there's a big difference. We're trying to find an oath where, as you say the oath, you're lying. However, maybe you said, I swear I'm going to eat tomorrow. And you really thought you were going to eat tomorrow. And then tomorrow, for whatever reason, you didn't eat. But because of that, you really could have been lying, been taking the oath honestly. It's just later you didn't keep your oath. Lo katani. So they didn't give a case like that because that doesn't mean you're a dishonest person. It just means you don't fulfill oaths, but that's different. Tinach ochal. Okay, so wait. That's a Shevuot Bitoy. This is about the future. But achalti v'lo achalti, if you took an oath that I ate yesterday or I didn't eat yesterday, and that was a lie, right? At the moment you said it, why didn't we list that one? To which the answer, Tanish Shevuot Shav v'chol dedamela. That actually was included because Shevuot Shav includes anything that's like it, and a Shevuot of the past, the Shaval, the Shevuot Bitoy would be like that. Okay, so after dealing with the first part, which we already reviewed, about the katzatz versus the right, and the two opinions about katzatz and how they differ from the case in the Mishnah of the socher. Then we moved on to the nigzal. We talked about that was under the person's clothes. Then we brought in a whole other sugya about being under the clothes where somebody claims you bought it, I bought it, and the other one says, no, I only lent it to you. And then we went to the case of who can take the oath, not only the owner of the house, even a shomer could take the oath about someone stealing the collateral. And then we had the thing about the injury, and we finished off with that. And with that, I'm going to wish everyone a good day.